This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Matt, Connell, here we are, back in rather a hot studio.
Sitting in the sauna.
Yeah, we are.
I feel like we should be sitting in here with towels on, you know. Are saunas even still a thing?
Oh, do you want a towel?
No, it's okay. I don't need a towel. I actually just wondered then,
rest of us need
sauna's
a
still
towel.
a thing. Is that a...
I was there today.
Hey?
I was in one today.
Oh, you're kidding? Really?
I was in one today.
Oh, that is so random. Who goes to the sauna anymore? What are you, out of the 80s or something? Was it a time machine or was it really a sauna?
That sauna's good.
Oh, wow.
It's packed out as well.
Some of us has to work, Matt, but Connell,
Wasn't that a bit of a health myth about this? Anyway, it doesn't matter. This isn't about...
No, it's not.
This isn't about
That's
that,
not
is
the
it?
perspective we're wanting to take.
No, that's right.
We are in our Worldview perspective series, and we're up to the next episode from the last episode. We're kind of losing track of where we're up to. I think it's episode 6.
We're at the next episode after the last episode.
That's right.
Very good. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes. Welcome, everyone. As per our previous episodes, we've got Connell with us. Connell's one of our great friends and a deep thinker, almost too deep for me most of the time. And, of course, Pastor Matt and myself, Stuart. And it's great to have you with us for Perspectives. And I'm not sure what episode number we're up to, but we're up to number 6 in our series on Worldview. Matt, jump into ethics.
Oh, yeah. Well, on our double axis, one of the things that we've recognised is that it dramatically changes how we conceive of ethics, any sense of right or wrong.
Yep.
If you're just working on a trajectory between pleasure and pain, then it's whatever maximizes pleasure is good. Whatever causes pain is bad. That's actually that's known as a utilitarian approach. It's very difficult, actually, even to sort of qualify what, like in terms of pleasure and pain. Are we talking like what? There's so many different forms of pleasure, and anyway, there's some complexities along that. But when you add the vertical axis, an axis that moves between the sacred at the top and a sense of defilement at the bottom, you're speaking essentially. You're adding an aspect of reality that deals with purpose. There's actually a sense. If we're talking about sacred, we're talking about something that has sacred purpose.
Yeah. Or to clarify though, purpose that's not the purpose we've set, but purpose.
Yeah, that's
set
right.
By someone else.
That's right.
Correct.
That's right.
Because our purpose would be to get to pleasure, but
that's right.
Exactly.
So there might be, we in common language talk about things that are sacred to us.
Yes. Yeah.
But sacred in the absolute sense is sacred by some transcendent measure, and it's a religious term, really. And so it speaks of purpose. Now, one of the interesting things is with pretty much up until very recent history, it was always understood that all of reality was imbued with some kind of purpose, that it was all moving somewhere. So there was some sense of what in philosophy you refer to as teleology. It was moving towards an end. Telos is end in Greek. And so, even philosophers, philosopher like Aristotle had this sense that everything is moving on a trajectory to actualize its potential. And so everything is wanting to become what it essentially is. So the acorn is always going to become the oak tree, right? And you saw all of reality unfolding like that.
Yep.
And so it had this sense that there's this, what a human being is, and what what a tree is, and what everything, that there's an essential sense of what that is, and to become that in the fullest and best sense is really the end of everything. That was Aristotle's idea. Theologians throughout church history have tended to agree with that and take on that idea because, of course, God created human beings to be something particular, right? It's not just we don't get to make up what we want to be or who we are, or we were created children of God, and we were created to reflect God's image and participate, as Peter says in his I think it's the second letter of Peter, talks about participating in the divine nature. And so there's a sense in which there's this, that's where the sacredness of humanity comes from. There's this purpose. But one of the things to note there is that that then completely changes your sense of right and wrong, right? Because if there's a purpose, then it's not just about whether something gives us pleasure or pain. It's whether it actually moves towards fulfilling that purpose. So something can be painful, and yet, as we've recognized, it can have this sanctifying effect. It can elevate us and, in a sense, work to strip away things and recover recover the divine image. That's something that we've talked about already. So that completely changes, a sense of right and wrong. So any sense of right and wrong has to have reference to a sense of what we think is the ultimate good for us. You have to have that sense of what the ultimate good is for us. To say, well, this is not tending, this line of action is not tending towards that or otherwise. So, and then that, and this is where I want to get to. And if you didn't understand all of that, another way of saying all of this is that our sense of right and wrong has reference to a story. The Bible is a story. It's the story of how God created the universe. Man fell away from God. It's the story of redemption. It's a story that that unfolds, has a direction and a destination. And so everything pertaining to right and wrong actually has reference to that story. It's been pointed out, and I think this is very true, that everyone, even if you deny, because one of the trend in the last sort of 40 or so, probably over 50 years actually, has been to deny all meta narratives. So because there's a sense that we don't really know what's the idea of any kind of governing story imposed upon life is, it's all artificial. It's like people resist that because they believe that it's this idea that the powerful people invent these stories to
Control.
Yeah, to control. They put themselves as the heroes and other people, and this is where you belong in the story, and this is where I belong. And so there was this not only skepticism around meta narratives, understanding reality in terms of one big story, but actually an outright hostility to that.
The word meta narrative is really backing away from the idea of a big, all-encompassing.
Well, no. It's sorry. I should meta, and we think meta. What do we think of? We think of
Facebook.
We think of Facebook. Meta is sort of the overarching. Has reference to something that's overarching, above, all embracing. Right.
That's what I meant. Like it's like an overarching. Big.
Yeah, that's right.
Big narrative.
Yeah, that's right. So a meta narrative is a big overarching narrative,
as opposed to, I guess everybody's got a narrative. We're all living in some kind of narrative or some sort of story.
Well, I mean, this is interesting because because it's been denied that there is really an that we almost just make up the story as we go along. That's the and in fact sort of make ourselves as we go along.
But maybe the story's simpler though.
Yeah,
the story that we live in now, if you set aside the meta narrative, it's essentially right and wrong is defined by whether or not it's hurting someone or that it's a very,
and you're right. Yeah,
it's a very small story, and it doesn't really get much bigger than that. Other than that, we all just keep out of each other's way in terms of imposing values and things on people.
Yeah.
As long as we abide by that story.
Yeah, that's very true. Good. Actually, because it's been argued actually that it's impossible for us not to have a story. And I think very compellingly it's been argued. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor essentially argues that this idea of just denying that there is, because we actually all understand ourselves in terms of a story. I mean, think about some of these and let's think, say about ethics. So we have this idea of even a sort of a Darwinian story, a Darwinian view of the universe. Okay, now when I speak of Darwinianism in this sense, I'm speaking in the bigger like Darwinian worldview, which is slightly different to a Darwinian science. It's the application of Darwinian principles to all of reality.
Well, it's the end,
which is very popular these days.
It's the philosophical implications of evolution. We're not talking about evolution or the science of evolution. We're talking about the philosophical endpoint of where that sort of leads people.
Yeah, well,
it's naturalism.
It's been the principle of the fact that, that we think now we can account for the development of not only life, but people have reasoned, well, if we can account for the development of life through this theory, then we can account for the development of everything through this theory. So it's become it's been extended, and this is what the philosopher Daniel Dennett does in a book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea, is that he says this idea it can be all-embracing and all of reality. It's just one algorithm, open-ended algorithm. It's not going anywhere. Yeah. It's just development for development's sake, right? Now, the thing is that's a story, right?
Yeah.
It's a meta-narrative. It's a story, and it actually has no rational undergird, like you can't verify that story. I mean, you can point to evidence of development. I mean, most people within biology don't deny that at some level evolution has happened, at the micro level at least.
Yeah.
So yes, you can, but that still doesn't. That's not really evidence for this making it an all-embracing view of reality, that this is the ultimate, because because you could have elements of evolution within a creation framework.
Yeah. So the problem with evolution isn't so much where you stand on the science of evolution.
Yeah.
Let's assume that's all true and given I'm not questioning that. The problem with evolution is it then starts to construct a story around that.
Yep, that's right.
That's the bit that we could say, well, right. That we actually don't accept the story that follows on from
which actually doesn't exist because it's made up as we go along in reality. And this is where people are saying the cultural, social constraints that we think are the norm or are right or ethical are just constraints we've put in as we've continued to evolve culturally.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no other reference than
there's nothing else
than what so right and wrong could be. As I think it was Michael Roos, a contemporary philosopher, argues for values based on evolution. He said, well, we are the most evolved creature in the universe, and so we need to do what we need to do for the betterment of that process. You know what I mean? We need to keep evolving. Now that's problematic, particularly if it's like if you've got natural selection and so forth, and it can become very problematic. But the point is that that's a story. It's a story that people tell that doesn't really have any more basis. It's than the biblical story in the sense that it's an object of faith essentially, and so it just here's another example. People say in the area of values and moral debates, and there's a lot of we live in a very moralistic time. I don't know if you noticed that, but people get very indignant about certain things, and in those fiery moments, they might talk about something being that's just medieval. Those are moments where they betray the fact that they're thinking within the framework of a story, because if any moral sensibility that I have has to have recourse to some kind of framework. So what story is that part of? Well, it's part of a story that says that, there was this wonderful sort of Greco-Roman thing, and then there was like these dark ages when the church and superstition took over, and then there was the Enlightenment, right? And we got back to reason, right? And now we're on this wonderful journey of progress, right? Yeah. And we're progressing, and there's evidence for that, but actually there's a whole lot of abundant literature to the contrary, saying yes, in a lot of respects we are evolving, but a lot of respects we're devolving. Like our technology is as problematic as it is advantageous.
Yeah, right.
But there's the belief in a story of progress, right? And this is so. For example, this is the story that dominated, that even started to dominate, in the 19th century, through the whole colonialist kind of thing. That this is civilization, and we have advanced. And the problem was that it was a progress story it was a civilization progress enlightenment story that got mixed in with the Christian message. This was the problem.
Yeah.
But actually, it was a story about, we've progressed, we're technologically advanced, and, we go into these environments where there are these primitive people and we don't take them too seriously. And probably, there was a lot of evolutionary theory in there, like they are less evolved, therefore, than we are. And that was all of that was mixed in very much in the 1800s.
And so we're going to do this because we think it's good for you.
Yeah, that's right.
You don't know that it's good for you now. It's good for you.
Yeah. So the ideals of civilization. I don't know if you guys have been. I love the program The Crown on. I've been watching that series, and I've heard a couple of times on that. In terms of what does the monarchy stand for, and it stands for the ideal of civilization. It represents this ideal of civilization, and it's an interesting one because that's a story that we tell ourselves that is essentially it's a story about humanistic progress. It's a story that is very consciously advocated by a contemporary philosopher called Steven Pinker. He's written a book called Enlightenment Now, and he argues that we will solve our that human beings have always adapted. It's the ultimate story of humanistic progress. We will solve our own problems with our own technology. Human beings are getting better and better and better. The world is getting better. And he cites a lot of evidence to show that in a lot of respects it has. Now, the interesting thing is a lot of the elements that have made things better actually come from a Judeo-Christian undergirding value, which is interesting. But you can see there's a story that's being told there.
But we're telling the story, really, aren't we? Like, I'm just trying to think that meta narrative that you were talking about before. It's almost like that is maybe that the problem that the world has with that is it's actually coming from outside in. There's a story that we're weaving as humanity.
Yeah.
In terms of we want to be in control of the story.
Absolutely.
We want to be.
Yeah, that's right.
So
we're telling our own story.
It's the difference between, us telling the story or something outside telling us what
that's
the
right.
story
It's
is.
the counterpart to us determining our own identity.
Yes.
If we're going to determine our own identity, if we're going to determine what's right and wrong, that is, we determine it. Then we've got to come up with our own story that justifies our sense of right and wrong and our sense of identity, right? And ultimately, that becomes a story of enlightenment and being, now we're more enlightened, and all of those medieval values and those Christian ethics. And the irony is actually that, and this is another interesting thing that's been pointed out, is a lot of these values have actually been key to making the civilization actually what it is. It's significantly empowered. Judeo-Christian values have significantly empowered our civilization. And that's been abundantly pointed out in, for example, Rodney Stark in The Triumph of Christianity, Tom Holland in his book Dominion, both coming from that's non-Christian historians. I'll emphasize that. But, they've made the point that actually what really has powered this civilization have been these values. But see, what happened was one of the most important contemporary philosophers, Alistair MacIntyre, has written his very famous book called After Virtue. And in this book, he basically shows how during the Enlightenment period, which is sort of roughly, sort of 1600s, late 1500s, 16th century through to the probably late 18th century, that the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, that what we tried to do is that with a grounding and a real taste for Judeo-Christian values, our civilization, because all these religious wars, particularly after the Reformation and the Catholic, and it's like, well, we need everyone's fighting now over beliefs. We need to find another basis for our values, right? Something that isn't based on past authority. Okay. And so they thought, well, what obvious choice here is reason. It's going to be something based on reason, right? So they embarked Enlightenment thinkers people like Descartes, Locke, Hume, Immanuel Kant, if it matters, these are names of philosophers, they embarked on this project, right, we're going to find a purely rational basis, right, for values, for ethics. And so they threw out the old, no reference to author, we'll throw out the old, dig up the old foundation, and we're going to, and in its place, we're going to build a new foundation based on autonomous human reason. Now, a lot of these people were believers, but they wanted to make something that was universally recognizable, which in some ways that's a commendable idea. Here's the problem though. The problem is that after sort of 300 years, they failed completely, right? And everyone acknowledged that they'd failed. So now we had no foundation we'd had no religious foundation, and we had no rational foundation for morality. We just had no foundation.
There's a vacuum.
So we had this sort of vacuum, and what it all came back to, it just, in the vacuum, it all became about me realizing my own happiness, essentially. That's a crude sort of summary of it, but
that's good.
But you get this sort of expressive individualism that I just,
and no one else's rules matter, just my rules, so long as I don't hurt you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's almost like you couldn't, they'd sort of uprooted something. And it's interesting that a lot of things were based on that, like the American, that declaration, that talks about the human rights and all that sort of, all of that's sort of based on that kind of rational, that because they said, we hold this to be self-evident. Right, which is a statement about rationality. Now, the fact it's actually not self-evident. No. This is the thing; it's not self-evident. But I mean, at the time when those guys wrote that, they thought it was self-evident. But it turns out that was completely contestable, and it actually lost the contest. Right.
What's interesting too is you said that was started by people who were believers, or most likely to be believers. It's interesting because that would mean that it's almost like we make that mistake now, because we've got our worldview, but in order to interact with the world, we kind of go, let's set our worldview aside and let's create a version of it that uses the world's narrative to make it unifying. So it's something that they can understand. So we pitch to that. It's like, okay, you want to be happy, so Christianity is going to make you happy. Now, there's some, I think we have to, that's an interesting point actually, because to some extent you have to connect with the felt needs and concerns of the people that we want to speak to. But the mistake is then, I guess the mistake is you actually exchange your worldview, because the whole point of these last lot of episodes is to say that really almost what we talk is difficult to even comprehend what it is that we're saying. Our values don't even make sense unless you understand the worldview that we're talking about. But if you set that aside and then try to take a different worldview, which is the world's worldview, and reconstruct something that re-emphasizes
like a Christian faith that is along that flat axis,
we end up with something that is like a corrupted version of it that actually does more damage, because it kind of almost looks and feels a bit like what Christianity is saying, but it's not. It actually looks hollow.
Which and happens all the time. That exact thing happens all the time, because it's, we try to construct a one-dimensional Christian faith that answers those felt needs, that sits within that. This is going to bring you the most pleasure. This is going to be, this is going to help you to realize your dreams and desires and wealth, health, and prosperity, or whatever. It's the sort of motivational kind of what has been referred to as, interestingly, as therapeutic deism. Okay. It's the God that comes in and just helps you out every now and again to achieve your dreams and goals, because isn't that what life's about, right? Well, it's not actually, because the story, actually the biblical story, is much different to that. So while we need to speak to the felt concerns of our culture, we need to be really careful actually to retain our multidimensional worldview, because actually there's something in our worldview that speaks, and this is what we've been saying, that speaks powerfully actually to a felt but unidentified felt need in a sense, and this is the point that is often made, and Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, in his book The Happiness Hypothesis, this is one of the key elements that he talks about that is vital for human well-being, is this experience of spiritual elevation. And it's from his book, actually, that I've created a simplified version. It's actually taken from his book, but it's that my double axis is a slightly simplified version of something that he uses. But see, it's interesting because he says we think in terms of this one single axis, the pursuit of pleasure, but and happiness, but actually, ultimate happiness requires some engagement with the sublime and the sacred, and that we appear to be wired for this dimension of human existence. Yeah. We clearly wired for a sense of transcendent purpose, right? We need purpose as one of the sort of intrinsic elements of well-being and happiness that's been abundantly recognized in the literature. A sense of purpose, right, to life, and we're built and wired for that. And so I think we have this powerful testimony. If we hold on to our worldview to speak into that, but actually to bring a whole other dimension to what is a felt need, but I think an unidentified in some ways, because there's all this.
I think the need's identified, but the way to satisfy that need, we try to use. You don't think the need's identified?
Well, I think it's not really articulated. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're right.
I think we go after all that stuff in our jobs, in our wealth, in our whatever it might be.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe a better way to put it is that it's almost like disguised. It's not recognized. It's a little bit like, the point that Mircea Eliade makes is that we've gotten rid of religion in his terms. He's a secular philosopher. We've got rid of religion, but we're religious beings fundamentally, and so we.
So how does he come up with that though? How does he decide that we're religious beings?
Because he's
that means he has to accept.
Yeah, because he takes an answer. Well, it's not that actually he's not a believer. I think he probably was, but he gets that from in a very general sort of sense. Sure. He gets that from a sort of almost an anthropological point of view. Like he sees that everywhere people are thoroughly religious. He just says we are religious. There's never been a culture that has not had some form
even
of
if it's
religion.
a naturalistic origin.
Yeah,
like still be a naturalistic origin that we kind of look outside ourselves as if something does transcend our own individuality and existence, even if there isn't.
Yeah, that's right.
We feel that there is.
That's right. So the religious impulse, he says, is absolutely irrepressible. And it comes out, exactly. And it comes out in all sorts of different weird ways. When we suppress it, it comes out in, searches for significance and all sorts of quasi-disguised religious behavior. And he goes and talks about all this different sort of religious style behavior. Even I referenced before the sort of moralism that like people really with this driving sense of purpose, with this sense of morality, this sense of right and wrong, that's all a bit garbled, all a bit self-contradictory, and it comes out as this almost religious-like behavior, where people want to almost take these prophetic stances to, and moralize about these issues and create a world that's and fight for this cause and it's all really religious behavior, and people do that. It's great, great self-sacrifice and form communities around that, and
and a naturalist would argue that that's why we've kind of evolved to where we are, is because of our ability to look out beyond ourselves rather than just completely be.
There are naturalistic explanations for religious behavior. One of the most annoying things. It's just so I get so annoyed because people cite that. Like I sometimes ask people, why don't you believe? Oh, well, I believe religion. Like I'll say, why don't you believe in God? And they say, well, I believe that religion is a result of, and they talk about that it evolved in this way. And I'll point out that actually atheism isn't the conclusion of that. It actually is the presupposition. Like, you have to presuppose atheism in order to believe that religion just evolved in this naturalistic way. That presupposes atheism. It's not an argument for atheism. You know,
what are you saying? It's internally inconsistent.
Well, only I mean, I'm saying it has an unjustified presupposition. It's, you know, that they're arguing from a presupposition. So they first presuppose, well, there's no God, so we need to account for religion in terms of a naturalistic, historical, evolutionary process, that maybe it's some leftover. I mean, but Dawkins' argument is some stupid argument about, excuse me getting annoyed here, but some stupid argument about, you know, some leftover, what does he call a hyperactive, a hyperactive agent detection device.
Okay.
In that we've evolved with. So, you know, so the bushes ruffle, right? And so we've evolved with this survival instinct that when the bushes rustle, we think there's someone there that wants to kill me. You know, so we get used to think where we see signs of agency, as in someone did it. And so that's become hyperactive, and it's created. We look at the stars and we say there must be a God. Yeah. That's
But this is like where I said before, the problem with evolution. Let's set aside the science of it. Let's assume that as a given. Let's just assume that. Don't want to discuss that this episode, but it's then the story that you tell of it. Tell from that. Yeah. Those collection. You've taken a collection.
It's a story.
Of facts,
you just told a story.
And what you've just done there is just told it. Now, there's absolutely no basis to say that. You've merely just said that if we're looking for an explanation naturally, then that's probably the best that we can come up with. But it's not. That's just a story.
It is. There's a great article actually, and listen, and this is one I do recommend. I should say that I throw out a lot of book names and whatever, but
yes,
just
you do.
That's my. Well, look, I mean, you know,
that's good. That's good.
This is just the space that I work in the sort of philosophy thing. So it's sort of my job to. But I just don't want to confuse everyone. So, but I do want to underscore that I don't recommend everything that I quote from. It's just useful to see different.
Yeah, none of these
views.
books are exactly so that you can explore different perspectives. They're not books that you go, this guy's saying something we should pay attention to. It's more understand how other people.
Yeah, it's just
think.
been across.
So the article
the arguments. Anyway, it's an argument by Austin Hughes, and it's in the New Atlantis journal, science journal, and it's called "The Folly of Scientism." And it's a great article where he basically says this whole, like he's an evolutionary scientist, so he's, and I don't know where he doesn't say where he's at faith or belief wise, but he says, guys, we are telling a story here we've created a metaphysical view. Like he said, one of the reasons that I love science is that it was pretty modest about what it could do. You know what I mean? We worked with evidence and we didn't go beyond the evidence. But he said now we've become a religion, you know, and we're telling these stories about how all of reality, you know, the whole universe has come about. And he said, you know, like theories of everything, we have gone way far. We've you know, gone way into metaphysics and we've gone way off track. And the point of writing the article is that he says we're actually threatening science. We're threatening the credibility of science because we're going so far outside the bounds of science. No one's going to take science seriously anymore. So that's why he's not arguing from a theistic point of view. He's saying, guys, if anyone's going to take science, can we stop doing this quasi-religious stuff, you know, and telling these big stories about reality and about how all reality unfolded. So,
and the risk of that is that you then create a bias where you just want to try to prove the theory is correct rather than find the truth.
Yeah.
You know, if science goes off on a theory, it's like, okay, now we're going to spend all our energy and time proving that theory is right when actually it could be...
Because it needs to answer all
the questions.
And this is, you know, I mean, and this is the bit that annoys me is that in so much historical literature that does, you know, the origins of mankind and there's always this stuff about religion, you know, this like a naturalistic explanation for religion. They tell this story and it's like, oh, it's the same old unfounded story and it's history going beyond history. It's assuming it's a way of doing history that goes beyond the bounds of the evidence, you know, that this is how religion evolved. Well, well, if there's no God, then that's how it would have happened. But
what if there was?
But that's right, But you're not actually. You're just assuming. Oh, well, there's no God, and so therefore this is how history happened. But you've completely, you've completely not justified your your original your first premise. So, that's and so I. So that just gets ingrained again and again. It's like on documentaries and it always talks about how religions came about and this whole, and it's the same. It's what you were talking about before when you talk about the little stories that we tell, but it's always part of a bigger story, isn't it? Because it's like to tell those little historical stories.
Yeah. Well, they only work if you consider them in isolation.
Yeah.
Like if you only just take the little story and just treat it as that. And then you don't go outside that, because then you don't see all the problems with those little stories start to fall apart.
Even the story about Christianity is when that story is told, is hugely problematic, because wherein does Christian history lie? Does it lie in because when we do history, what do we look at? We look at conflict, great battles, kings and queens, power struggles,
country borders.
Like that's history, right? In our sense. Now, it's very clear from the teaching of Jesus that that's not where that the kingdom of God will affect that and interact with that. But that's not where the kingdom of God, he said, that will be like yeast through the dough. It'll be like a little seed becoming a tree, right? So it's grassroots. It's not about battles and power struggles but so what historians do is they look at, they look for the battles and the power struggles that had the Christian stamp on it, because let's face it, if you want to manipulate a large group of people, the tool that you're going to grab hold of to do that is religion is a really good tool to do that, right? Now, that doesn't make religion false. It actually testifies to how powerfully compelling it is to the human conscience, right? Yeah. So just because people misuse it doesn't mean that it's not true, right? And yet, we're told this story about about church history that makes it look like it's all power struggles and corruption and kings and queens and the people killing each other in the name of God. It's like no, a biblical view of Christian history that's not where it's happening. It's the things actually that we don't know about. It's the anonymous people that weren't famous, that weren't powerful. I mean, Jesus said that this would be this way. It's the weak, right? It's the nameless. It's the weak. It's the nameless, not the famous, right? It's the stuff that's not in the historian's eye that constitutes the real history of the kingdom of God in that sense.
So there's a story there, that's another story, little story of the world, which is to cast a dispersion on the Christian story.
Yeah, well,
create a false version of the Christ, and everybody goes, "Oh, well, I'm buying into that story, so that's why Christianity is bad."
Well, it's essentially fitting Christianity into their stories. You were saying this off mic before, Stu. Yeah. That we see the sort of Christian story or the biblical story constantly sort of fitted into this secular cultural story. The story of, I mean, it's not just a story. There's lots of stories, but the story of this sort of evolving whatever.
So when we're talking about this other dimension, there's a tendency then to take the sacred and profane and fit it into that story as well.
Yeah. So to account for that, so people would say, well, they created the sacred so that, well, the king is sacred and and therefore you have to do what he said.
Yeah.
And defilement is just a way of manipulating you to do what we want. Well, if you do that, and if you're that, then
Or the sacred could be a thing that I need in order to feel fulfilled. I've got the spiritual dimension in my life.
Yeah.
That's saying there's
which is just a reworking of the word.
But doesn't that where we kind of devalue words, that when they try to put it back onto that single dimension, the word actually takes on another devalued meaning. And I think the important thing what we want to say here is that it is a multidimensional thing. So the word sacred, we're not taking word sacred and saying, where does it fit in that line?
Like it's really important to me, and so it's sacred. Yeah,
it's actually something that it sits on another axis. It's actually another dimension. It's not pleasure. It's not pleasure. It's not pain. It doesn't even fit on that line, and it's drawn.
Well, that line's irrelevant to it, really. That line, the pleasure and pain line, is almost irrelevant.
Well, I think the idea of the sacred and like that axis probably gives a broader meaning to that horizontal axis, if we're going to. I mean, let's not get too caught up on this, because in a sense, it broadens our notion of pleasure. Pleasure suddenly becomes something, because we talked about the connection between pleasure and the sublime. There's this. There are these higher pleasures for which, in fact, our hearts are made for those sort of things. But even the invention of even concepts like that, that people will argue that was invented by power mongers to manipulate other people and make them seem more important and create a sort of a social hierarchy. And so, so you get, and I mean, that was a very popular story in, the whole, everything is about power and power struggles. That's essentially it's the sort of Marxist kind of story. Everything is about class struggle. And it was picked up in the 60s, where everything is power. Everything is about this sort of power struggles in society between one group and another, and so so that's a story, isn't it? It's like everything is power struggles, and that becomes our story, right? That's just a story that we tell.
So I think,
and religion fits into that.
I want to make
story. They say.
I think we should make a note here. There's another podcast here, another idea that I think we need to and this
ladies
is
and gentlemen,
I've
Connell is
thinking about
the next podcast. This better be a good idea.
Is given the multi-dimension axis and the stuff that we've spent all this time talking about, that gives a framework to talk about the things and our values and why we think and who God is and how a relationship to Him. If we were then going to talk to the world and someone who's got no idea, which is probably most people, of that kind of concept.
Well, they have their own story.
How do we get past all of those preconceptions, and we haven't got hours to sit there and draw axes on a page and go, here's the profane and here's the sacred and this. And
good question.
It's kind of like, okay, I'm sitting in front of someone who's maybe critical of my values and why I think the way I do. The natural thing is to buy their narrative, their story, and me to try to give good reasons. How do I fit that into their story? What we really have to be able to do is fit it into the bigger worldview that we've been talking about, but we haven't got hours to, first of all, lay the groundwork on what that actually looks like. So how do you have that conversation?
The assumption there is that to change someone's, for someone's worldview to be transformed, that there's a whole lot of sort of all of this intellectual stuff that they need to understand. Now, it's not that this is not important. I should say that, seeing we've just spent but here's the thing, how did I come to understand? I didn't work all this out. In fact, I was convinced as a late teen. I was a convinced atheist. Absolute convinced atheist. Now, it was actually an encounter with God that completely transformed my worldview. It's like, oh man, it just completely flipped me upside down, right? And then, and then it was after that, it's understanding, it's faith first and then understand, and reflection on something that I realized. So
I get that, but we get forced into having conversations.
Yeah.
And
because you're right. Are we going to sit here and so listen to think, right? I've got to desperately take notes, and when I'm next having a conversation, I'm going to pull out my notebook and go through everything that
all these names of philosophers.
as though winning an argument, winning an argument is going to change someone's heart. Well, it's not, right? This it's important that I think that as Christians we understand some of this sort of stuff.
Totally.
But having understood this, we recognize then that actually that whole other dimension of the sacred is already built into the person we're talking to. They already have a very deep, irrepressible intuition of this. We ourselves actually are windows to that reality. This is the thing. This is why the most powerful thing that you can do is share your story. Because your story is the first glimpse that they're going to get of the big story. You are the window to that bigger story. We have this tendency to sort of abstract things and want to argue over abstract ideas. But actually tell the story, tell your story and how you and why this is so important. And what you see in the early church even is, when Paul goes to different places, and what does he do? He tells his story. He says, this is where I was, and this is how I came to be where I am.
Although maybe in that time they hadn't rejected, they still had
spirituality,
a better model already start. Like, I'm still thinking, and what you say is great, we've got to share our story, but I still think people will, there's value in at least just diffusing a situation and saying what might look like completely wrong, like from what I'm saying, because of your worldview, in being able to communicate to someone. There's actually, before we even talk about why I think what I do, there's something else that you need to just understand what I'm saying in this context.
Yeah.
Right, because whatever I say is going to sound really offensive in your
So what you're saying,
and we often don't have the even opportunity to share our story. It's just, you could be on TV, get asked, you're a Christian, you think this, why do you think that? And it's like, and watching people do it.
Which happens when people find out you're Christian and ask you, what do you think of this?
I'm not sure that we do a very good job of that.
That's a really good point. And I think this is where actually we've got to be careful about being drawn into those theoretical arguments. Like often I don't engage with that at that level. I will if people say, well, so do you think this is wrong? And I will come back to my, well, I actually believe that this is a really sacred element of my life. And to me, and that means, and so I know it sounds like I'm relativizing it, but it just dampens because it sends the message, because the hostility comes from the power struggle narrative, because they think we're trying to take power, right? And unfortunately, a lot of Christian dialogue, a lot of Christian voices, loud Christian voices, sound like we're trying to take power in our nation right now. Actually, that's not how the kingdom of God works, right? So we've actually got to, in a way, go out of our way to try and sort of counter that. I'm not. I think we want to say, I'm not trying to enforce this on you. Let me explain why this is so precious to me, right? And I think that's a better approach, rather than argue about what people should do or what, actually to try and personalize it as much as possible. That, to me, that works to diffuse, because I'm talking about the choices that I'm making about how I live my life. And then I become a bit of a window to that person. And I will try as much as possible to get to sharing personally about that and why that is so important to me. And actually, you'll find that does diffuse a lot of the heat in arguments.
Because a lot of the when you watch these things get played out, a lot of the time it does come out, it does sound like, and this is probably because we haven't got those multi-dimensional axes to refer to. So it all comes down to, I think it's right. I think it's just right, or it's right and wrong. And we're actually not saying, we're saying it's right or wrong to me, but I'm not saying, Christianity's not saying, I want to stop you from doing that, or I want to discriminate against you because of that, or I want to attack you because of that. I might believe it to be right or wrong because of there's reasons that I believe that, but it comes across as if because I think you're doing a wrong thing, you're doing a bad thing, therefore I think that you should be pulled down and attacked or vilified or and that's we've never said that.
The power thing, yeah.
And
we've never said that, but sometimes people take it to mean that. Yeah, that's how it comes across sometimes. I mean, another way to put that, when you're talking about right and wrong on that one single axis, then the only real expression for that becomes a political expression. This is why people's values automatically turn into politics, because it's got nowhere else to go. Like, how are we going to change the world, right? Well, there's only one option, really, and that's politically. That's the only way that if you lack any transcendent, you don't believe in God, the only way that we're going to change the world is through politics. This is why people get so passionate about politics, because it's the only way we're going to change things. This is what is so problematic about Christians getting equally passionate about politics, because we should know better. We should know that isn't actually how Jesus changes the world. Of course, Jesus uses politics at times, and he can use bad politics or good politics. Yeah. The story about the Reformation in England being because Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, right? Yeah. It's like, well, that that was used by God to create greater freedom, ultimately in England. But the fact is that just because I think something's right or wrong doesn't mean that I think it should be enforced on others politically. And so, in fact, I could even think that actually, because I think this is right, I particularly don't want it to be forced on someone else, because I want them to value it for what it is.
But I think this also comes back to the world trying to retell another story. Yeah. They want you to tell the story that they're trying to make, which is that's exactly what you're trying to do. You're trying to force your views on it, and your views are just what you happen to think, and you're now trying to force that on someone else. So they're casting a story. It's like a net that they're trying to catch you in, because that's a story that they want to tell. And I think a lot of the time we fall into that because we kind of get very careful and passive in it. We're not approaching it necessarily confidently, like going, we're taking control of the conversation in a way, and actually steering it away from ever getting into that territory, and reframing it in something that allows us to actually get across what we're trying to say. I haven't got the answer for that, and that's been playing over in my mind as to how do we draw those ideas into a way of actually how we engage in those conversations in a much more healthy way. And that's kind of where I think, mate, it's kind of how do we communicate our perspective and understand their perspective in a more healthy way. And that's what these podcasts are about, perspectives. And I just think we don't want to necessarily shy off and back away from what our perspective and worldview is. I think from what the things we've talked about, it needs to get out there, because that's the thing that we're actually lacking. We need to get people, put it out there so people start asking questions about it, and they not necessarily understand it, but they kind of get little pieces of it, go, I hadn't really thought about it.
So being true to it is the way, is I think the key way to do that is actually to live out that story. So, for example, if we play the game of the world, right, trying to win, get power, we're living in the wrong story there. You know what I mean? That's the wrong story.
Yeah.
What was so powerful about the early church is they didn't play the game. They didn't play the, let's be the biggest and the best and the most powerful, and they were living out a completely different worldview, right? Different values. And they weren't trying to force that on everyone else. They just modeled that, right? And it had this enormous impact on a society that were actually at first very hostile, because it was so different from the values of their society. That people were so hostile towards them, but they really won people over because they weren't trying to force it on. There's the wrong kind of persecution. The wrong kind of persecution when I try and play that game and force my values on people, and then of course that's going to arouse a resentment. Yeah. But the right kind of persecution, I guess, is when we as Christians, we become a fairly confrontational presence in society, and but I think we've got to be very careful that we're not playing the wrong game, that we live out our worldview, live in it. We actually can become windows to it. It's like people through us can have this experiential encounter with the reality of God just by us living the life that we're meant to live, know.
So for me, the thing that keeps coming back to my mind, I think for us in the church, and looking at the examples you often, you've talked about, you see on TV and all that kind of stuff, we're really busy about telling everybody what's wrong with their worldview instead of actually reflecting and showing what's right about ours. Everyone knows what the church is against. What's the church for?
Yeah.
And I don't know that we know how to articulate that
Well, I don't know
particularly well.
I don't know that a lot of people, Christians in the church, could articulate it. And this is why I think this whole discussion of all of this series, while we've gone around it quite a long route, weaving in and out and all sorts of themes, I think fundamentally
That's
inside
the
the church,
Yeah.
we need, and especially as a lot of people inside the church are scratching their head going, have we got it wrong as Christians? Because they haven't got the worldview. They don't actually get the worldview that they even have, because they have now adopted the world's worldview, and they're trying to interpret their faith into that, and then starting to think, well, mate, actually it doesn't make sense, because it's never going to make sense in that worldview. And I think that's why it's so important for people to be able to grab hold of it and understand it, so that outside, when we are having those conversations, we're able to give people a better glimpse into the window that we are, where most of us would go out there and someone brings something up and it makes us feel uncomfortable. We kind of get defensive about it, and then we end up buying into the worldview, and it actually just propagates the wrong story.
Yeah, so all we try to do then is deconstruct their view rather than construct ours, rather than present.
Yeah, there's got to be a different way of
another podcast for sure.
And that's why I said, like,
I think that there's going to be an increasing, as people move further and further away from acknowledging any element of the transcendent and the sacred, and in any sense that's not controlled by them, because there's those terms can be used in ways that are very convenient and controlled by the individual. But in the genuine sense, as people are starved of that, I think it's going to be a hunger for something real. I know for a lot of people it feels like, oh man, the world's moving, like it's almost like we're moving into a much darker space in terms of, any sort of absence of truth and all of this sort of stuff. But remember, light shines more brightly in darkness. Light shines brightly in darkness, and we are the light. So could it be that God's allowing things to get darker so that we shine brighter? I think so.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.